There are moments in the history of warfare when a smaller force, outgunned, outmanned, and written off by the world, reaches deep into the chest of its enemy and squeezes. Not out of desperation, not out of rage, but out of cold, calculated, disciplined will. What happened over Russian skies in the early hours of this week was not a headline. It was not a news cycle. It was a message. And that message was written in fire, smoke, and precision. 1,500 kilometers inside Russian territory, at facilities the Kremlin believed were untouchable. By the time you finish watching this, you will understand why this moment changes everything. You will understand what it means for the trajectory of this war. And you will understand why the most dangerous force on any battlefield is not the one with the most tanks. It is the one that refuses to accept the limits others have placed upon it. Stay with me. Because what I'm about to lay out goes far deeper than burning oil tanks and grounded parade routes. This is about something the military academies call strategic reach. And what Ukraine just demonstrated in a single night is that it has mastered it. Let me take you back to a principle I have carried with me since my earliest days as a naval officer. Something that was drilled into every SEAL candidate who ever stood at the edge of the cold Pacific at Coronado, shivering, exhausted, and wondering whether they had anything left. The principle is this: your enemy's sense of security is your most powerful weapon. The moment your adversary believes he is safe, the moment he stops scanning the horizon, the moment he pulls his guard inward and concentrates his shields around what he loves most, that is the moment you strike what he thought was beyond your reach. That is not cruelty. That is strategy. That is the oldest and most honest truth in the doctrine of warfare. And Ukraine, in the darkness before dawn, delivered that truth to Russia with devastating effect. On the night in question, Ukrainian drones and long-range strike assets reached deep into the Perm region of Russia, a city and industrial zone that sits well beyond 1,500 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Let that number settle in for a moment. 1,500 kilometers. That is not a border skirmish. That is not a retaliatory strike along a front line. That is a long-range power projection of the kind that changes how both sides understand the dimensions of this conflict. The target was not symbolic. A major oil pumping and refining facility, a node in Russia's energy infrastructure, the kind of target that fuels both the Russian war machine and the Kremlin's financial lifelines, was struck with enough force to disrupt operations and force the cancellation of regional public events, including a Victory Day parade in Perm itself. And that detail, that parade cancellation, is not a footnote. It is the headline within the headline. Pay attention to it, because I will return to it. And when I do, you will see the full weight of what Ukraine achieved in a single operational window. Now, I want to be precise here because precision matters. In the SEAL teams, we had a saying: amateurs talk about tactics, professionals talk about logistics, but masters talk about narrative. What Ukraine did on this night was not only logistical and tactical, it was narrative. It was the crafting of a story that would be felt in Moscow boardrooms, in Kremlin strategy sessions, in the barracks of Russian conscripts, and in the living rooms of ordinary Russian citizens who were told for years that the war was far away, that it was contained, that it was under control. One drone reaching a parade route, one pumping station on fire in the Urals, one column of smoke rising from a facility the Russian public was never supposed to see burning. And suddenly, the story changes. Suddenly, the war is not far away. Suddenly, the war is at home. That is what strategic reach does. It does not just destroy infrastructure. It destroys the psychological architecture of invulnerability. And once that architecture cracks, it is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. I have seen this dynamic play out on multiple theaters and multiple continents throughout my career. When an enemy feels truly safe, he is bold. When he stops feeling safe, he becomes reactive. And reactive enemies make mistakes. They overcommit to protection. They pull resources inward. They begin to shrink their operational ambitions. Ukraine, on this night, did not just hit an oil facility. Ukraine forced Russia to ask a question it does not want to answer. Where are we vulnerable next? But before we get to what comes next, and I promise you, what comes next in this analysis will reframe everything you think you know about the current phase of this war. I need you to understand something about the men and women behind these strikes, because this is not a story about machines. This is not a story about drones and coordinates and fuel capacities. This is a story about human beings who decided in the face of overwhelming odds that they were going to reach further than anyone thought possible. And that decision, that act of will, is the most important weapon in any arsenal. When I was preparing for complex operations as a commander, one of the first things I looked for in my team was not technical skill. Technical skill can be trained. What I looked for was the capacity to hold a vision under pressure, the capacity to commit to a target, to a mission, to an objective, not when conditions were perfect, but precisely when conditions were at their worst. Because conditions are never perfect. The weather is never right. The intelligence is never complete. The resources are never fully sufficient. Every operation in history that succeeded did so not because everything aligned, but because the people executing it refused to let imperfect conditions become an excuse for inaction. What Ukraine's strike operators demonstrated on this night is exactly that quality. They flew assets across one of the most heavily monitored and air-defended territories on the planet. They navigated Russian early warning systems, electronic countermeasures, and patrol corridors. They reached a target 1,500 kilometers from home, and they hit it. That is not luck. That is the product of meticulous planning, relentless rehearsal, and the kind of institutional courage that is built over years, not overnight. And yet, here is what is even more remarkable, and I want you to hold on to this thought because it connects directly to a dimension of this conflict that the mainstream narrative consistently underestimates. The strike on Perm was not an isolated event. It was part of a coordinated, multi-vector operational picture that unfolded across a single night. Reports from the same operational window indicate strikes on naval assets in the Caspian Sea region, specifically targeting a vessel capable of launching long-range caliber cruise missiles. Think about that for a moment. A landlocked sea, thousands of kilometers from Ukraine's borders, home to Russian naval forces that have operated there with near total impunity since the early phases of the conflict. And yet, on this night, Ukrainian special operations and strike assets reached into that theater as well, with results that Ukrainian military sources described as, and I am quoting directly from the official statement, satisfactory. In military language, satisfactory from an operational commander means the target was serviced. It means the mission was accomplished. It means that another platform that has been raining destruction on Ukrainian cities from the relative safety of the Caspian Sea has been denied that safety permanently. This is the pattern that every serious military analyst needs to be tracing right now. Not just the individual strikes, but the expanding radius. The geometry of Ukrainian operational reach has been growing incrementally, methodically, with each passing month of this conflict. And what we witnessed on this particular night represents a new outer boundary on that geometry. Russia woke up the following morning to discover that no corner of its territory, not the industrial Urals, not the landlocked Caspian, not the energy corridors it has used to fund and sustain its military campaigns, is beyond the reach of Ukrainian precision. And that realization, once it takes root in a military and political leadership, does not simply create tactical problems. It creates existential strategic anxiety. And strategic anxiety, when it sits inside a centralized authoritarian system like Russia's, generates exactly the kind of rigid, defensive, inward-looking decision-making that historically precedes major operational failures. Now, I told you the parade cancellation in Perm was not a footnote. Let me explain why. Victory Day, May 9th, is not simply a holiday in Russia. It is a load-bearing pillar of the political and social contract between the Kremlin and the Russian people. It is the day on which the entire mythology of Russian national identity, the narrative of sacrifice, of heroism, of ultimate triumph over an existential enemy, is publicly renewed and displayed. It is the day that Putin uses year after year to remind his population why the state exists, why the military exists, why the hardships of ordinary Russian life are worth enduring. The parade is not theater, it is theology. It is the annual sacrament of the Russian nationalist worldview. And when Ukraine's strikes forced the cancellation of the Perm Parade, and when reports began emerging of similar disruptions and heightened security measures rippling outward to other Russian cities, something happened that goes far beyond operational damage to an oil facility. The sacrament was interrupted. The mythology of invulnerability, the one that Putin has spent 25 years carefully constructing and maintaining, developed a visible crack. Not a fatal fracture, not yet, but a crack. And anyone who has studied the history of authoritarian regimes knows this. It is not the big breaks that bring them down. It is the accumulation of small cracks, each one a little deeper than the last, each one a little harder to plaster over with propaganda and ceremony. Let me be direct with you now. I have spent my career studying conflict. I have operated in theaters across multiple continents. I have seen wars that were won not on the battlefield, but in the imagination, in the minds of civilian populations, in the confidence of military commands, in the calculations of political leaders who decided at some point that the cost of continuing had become greater than the cost of stopping. And what I am watching Ukraine do in this phase of the war is precisely the kind of multi-domain pressure campaign that creates those calculations. It is not happening overnight. It is not clean or fast or free of tragedy, but it is deliberate, it is disciplined, and it is working. Here is something that the critics of Ukraine's long-range strike campaign consistently miss. And I want you to think carefully about this because it cuts to the heart of the strategic debate happening right now in every capital from Washington to Warsaw to Kyiv. There is a school of thought that says Ukraine's drone and missile strikes deep into Russian territory are primarily symbolic, that they cause limited physical damage relative to their cost, that they are designed more for domestic Ukrainian morale than for genuine military effect. And on a narrow mechanical reading of individual strike outcomes, that argument has some surface validity. An oil facility can be repaired, a naval vessel can be replaced, a parade can be rescheduled. But that argument fundamentally misunderstands what these strikes are actually doing. They are not designed to win the war in a single night. They are designed to impose cumulative costs, financial, psychological, logistical, and political, across the entire depth of Russian territory. They are designed to force Russia to defend everywhere simultaneously, which means it cannot concentrate its strength anywhere decisively. They are designed to make the Russian homeland feel the war that Russian leadership has for over 3 years been careful to keep abstract and distant for its own population. And they are succeeding at all of those objectives. Think about what it costs Russia to protect 1,500 kilometers of industrial infrastructure from drone strikes. Think about the radar networks, the air defense batteries, the electronic warfare assets, the personnel, the command and control architecture required to maintain even a rudimentary defensive posture across that kind of geographic depth. Every ruble spent on defending the Perm oil facility is a ruble not spent on offensive operations in the Donbass. Every air defense battery repositioned to guard an energy corridor is a battery that cannot protect a frontline advance. This is the mathematics of strategic pressure. It is not glamorous. It does not produce the kind of dramatic battlefield footage that drives social media engagement. But it is as real and as decisive as any tank battle or artillery duel. And Ukraine has figured out how to play it with remarkable sophistication for a nation that 3 years ago was given by many Western analysts no more than 72 hours before it would collapse. And what comes next will challenge everything you think you know about where this war is actually headed. Because the story of these strikes does not end with burning oil tanks and canceled parades. It connects to a far larger strategic picture that is unfolding right now in real time at the negotiating tables, in the intelligence communities, and in the operational commands on both sides of this conflict. The geometry of this war is shifting, and understanding why and in whose favor requires us to look not just at what happened on this single night, but at the pattern those strikes reveal, the capabilities they demonstrate, and the decisions they are forcing in Moscow, in Washington, and in European capitals that have been watching this conflict with a careful and calculating eye. Because here is what the Kremlin understands, even if it will never say it publicly. A nation that can reach your oil infrastructure in the Urals and your naval vessels in the Caspian on the same night is not a nation that is losing. It is a nation that is developing. It is a nation whose operational capacity is growing, not shrinking, 3 years into a war that was supposed to end in days. And that reality, that slow, grinding, stubborn, disciplined accumulation of capability, is perhaps the most important strategic fact on the board right now. Not the ceasefire proposals, not the diplomatic maneuvering, not the parade schedules and the political theater. The fact that Ukraine can reach further today than it could 6 months ago. And the question every serious strategist must now be asking is this: how far will it reach 6 months from now? There is a moment in every prolonged conflict, and I have lived through enough of them to recognize it with absolute certainty, when the momentum shifts. Not with a single explosion, not with a single headline. The shift happens quietly, beneath the noise of daily reporting, in the accumulation of small but irreversible facts on the ground. It happens when one side's operational ceiling keeps rising, while the other side's strategic flexibility keeps shrinking. It happens when the defender becomes the aggressor, and the aggressor starts defending. And it happens almost always before the political and media establishments are ready to acknowledge it. We are in that moment right now, and the strikes we have been examining are not the cause of that shift. They are the symptom of it. They are the visible evidence of something that has been building quietly and relentlessly in Ukrainian military doctrine, Ukrainian intelligence architecture, and Ukrainian national will for the better part of 3 years. Understanding that building process is the key to understanding everything that follows. Let me take you into something that most analysts overlook when they assess Ukraine's long-range strike capability. When we talk about a drone traveling 1,500 kilometers to hit a target in the Perm region, we talk almost exclusively about the machine. We talk about the airframe, the warhead, the navigation system, the fuel capacity, and those are important. But the machine is the last 5% of the equation. The first 95% is the intelligence infrastructure that identified the target, assessed its value, calculated the approach corridor, mapped the air defense environment, timed the strike window, coordinated the multi-vector package, and then evaluated the results for follow-on planning. That infrastructure, the human networks, the satellite feeds, the signals intelligence, the pattern of life analysis, is the true measure of a nation's military maturity. And what these strikes reveal is that Ukraine has built, under conditions of active warfare, under constant pressure, under the kind of institutional stress that would have broken most military organizations, an intelligence and targeting architecture of genuine world-class sophistication. That is not an accident. That is the product of years of partnership, training, and hard-won battlefield learning. And it is the foundation upon which every future operational escalation will be built. Now I want to speak directly to something that has been circulating in the strategic commentary surrounding these events. A line of thinking that I believe is not only analytically wrong, but dangerously wrong. There are voices in various capitals and various media ecosystems who look at Ukraine's deep strikes and see provocation, who look at a burning oil facility in the Urals and see escalation without purpose, who argue that striking Russian territory this deeply, this consistently, risks triggering a response that could spiral beyond anyone's ability to control. I want to address that argument head on, because it deserves a serious answer rather than a dismissal. The argument conflates provocation with pressure. It confuses escalation with strategy, and it fundamentally misreads the historical record of how wars of this type actually end. Wars between a large authoritarian power and a smaller democratic nation, and history gives us more examples of this dynamic than we would like, do not end because the smaller nation stops fighting. They do not end because the smaller nation moderates its actions out of concern for the larger power's comfort level. They end for one of two reasons. Either the smaller nation is defeated, its resistance crushed, its political will broken, or the larger nation reaches a calculation, a cold, hard, strategic calculation that the cost of continuing has exceeded any plausible benefit from victory. That second calculation is not reached through restraint by the smaller power. It is reached through sustained, credible, escalating pressure that makes the cost of the war real and unavoidable for the population and leadership of the larger power. Ukraine's deep strikes are not provocation. They are the mechanism by which that calculation is being forced. Every oil facility that burns in the Urals, every naval vessel denied its operational status in the Caspian, every parade that cannot be held because security resources are stretched to their limit. Each of these is a data point in a calculation that is building, slowly but inexorably, inside the Russian system. And here is where it gets strategically significant in a way that most commentary has not fully processed. Russia is not just experiencing military pressure from these strikes. It is experiencing financial pressure. Energy infrastructure is not incidental to Russia's warfighting capacity. It is central to it. The revenue generated by Russian oil and gas production funds the defense budget, funds the procurement of weapons systems, funds the salaries of the soldiers on the front line. When you strike a pumping station in Perm, you are not just creating a local disruption. You are inserting a hairline fracture into the financial architecture that sustains the entire Russian military enterprise. Multiply that hairline fracture across dozens of similar strikes over dozens of operational windows, and you begin to understand why the economic dimension of Ukraine's deep strike campaign is as important as its psychological and military dimensions. You are not just hurting Russia on the battlefield, you are making the war itself more expensive to fight. And a war that becomes more expensive to fight for an economy already strained by sanctions, by capital flight, by demographic decline, and by the quiet but persistent brain drain of its most educated and capable citizens, that war becomes, over time, a war that cannot be sustained at its current intensity. The math is unforgiving, and Ukraine understands the math. But if you think the financial dimension of this campaign is the deepest layer of what we are witnessing, you are not yet seeing the full picture. Stay with me, because what I am about to describe is the dimension that keeps strategic planners awake at night on both sides of this conflict. And it has almost nothing to do with oil facilities or parade routes. The deepest and most consequential effect of Ukraine's demonstrated long-range strike capability is what it does to Russia's internal political geography. Russia is not a monolith. It is a federation, a vast, multi-ethnic, multi-regional entity held together not by genuine democratic consent, but by a carefully maintained system of centralized authority, selective resource distribution, and above all, the cultivation of a sense of shared national identity rooted in military strength and territorial invulnerability. Putin's political power does not rest on popularity in the conventional sense. It rests on the perception, carefully managed and relentlessly reinforced, that he is the guarantor of Russian security, Russian greatness, and Russian order. The moment that perception fractures, the moment ordinary Russians in Perm, in Kazan, in Yekaterinburg, in cities across the Urals and Siberia begin to feel that the war has come to them, that the Kremlin cannot protect them, that the promises of security and greatness are hollow, the political calculus inside Russia begins to shift in ways that are very difficult to predict and almost impossible to reverse. I am not suggesting that Ukraine's strikes will trigger a popular revolution in Russia tomorrow. History does not move that quickly, and the Russian state retains formidable instruments of social control. But I am saying that the cumulative psychological effect of a war that keeps coming home, of parade cancellations, of burning refineries visible on the horizon, of airport closures and flight delays, and the thousand small disruptions that tell a civilian population that their government cannot keep them insulated from the consequences of its decisions. That cumulative effect is a strategic force multiplier that operates on a timeline measured in months and years, not days and weeks. And Ukraine is playing that long game with a discipline and patience that, frankly, I find remarkable for a nation fighting for its survival. Because survival tends to produce urgency, and urgency tends to destroy patience. The fact that Ukraine's military and political leadership has managed to maintain strategic patience, to resist the temptation to seek dramatic, immediate victories at the cost of sustainable, long-term pressure, speaks to a level of institutional maturity that deserves far more recognition than it typically receives. Now, let me turn to something that I believe is being systematically underreported in the Western narrative about this conflict, and that connects directly to the events we have been examining. There is a tendency in media coverage of this war to focus almost exclusively on the front line, on the territorial map, on which village was taken and which was lost, on the kilometer-by-kilometer accounting of gains and retreats. And I understand why. The front line is visible. It is measurable. It produces the kind of dramatic imagery that drives engagement and tells a simple story of winning and losing. But the front line in a conflict of this nature and scale is perhaps the least important indicator of strategic trajectory. The truly decisive action is happening in the deep operational space, in the targeting decisions, the logistics corridors, the energy infrastructure, the command and control nodes, the financial networks, and it is happening largely out of sight of the cameras that define the public narrative of the war. What Ukraine did on this night, reaching 1,500 kilometers to strike an energy facility, simultaneously servicing a naval threat in the Caspian, was a deep operational action of the highest strategic significance. And the fact that it has been reported primarily as a dramatic news item rather than analyzed as the strategic inflection point it represents is a failure of the analytical infrastructure surrounding this conflict. Let me be precise about what I mean by strategic inflection point. An inflection point is not a moment when everything changes at once. It is a moment when the trajectory changes, when the curve bends in a new direction and continues bending. Before this operational window, the prevailing narrative about Ukraine's deep strike capability was one of aspiration. Ukraine wanted to reach further. Ukraine was developing the capability to reach further. Ukraine occasionally demonstrated elements of that capability in carefully calibrated strikes. After this operational window, that narrative shifts from aspiration to establishment. Ukraine has now demonstrated in a single coordinated operation the ability to strike two separate strategic target sets, energy infrastructure and naval assets, separated by vast geographic distances on the same night with sufficient precision and effect to produce results that forced operational and political responses from the Russian side. That is not aspiration. That is capability. Documented, demonstrated, undeniable capability. And in the language of military deterrence and strategic competition, demonstrated capability is worth 100 times more than potential capability because it forces your adversary to plan against what you can actually do, not what they hope you cannot. And here is the dimension of this that will challenge you most, because it touches not just on what Ukraine is doing, but on what the world is choosing to see and what it is choosing to ignore.